The Canadians fight like wild men. They attack in the dark. They attack in the rain. They do not stop when soldiers get hurt. These were not the words of someone trying to scare people. They were not made up stories from a frightened soldier. These were the careful notes written in reports by experienced German officers during World War II. For the German army, and especially for the tough SS soldiers, fighting on the Western Front was a nightmare of powerful weapons. But within that nightmare, there was a list of who they feared most. When the German soldier looked across the burned fields of Normandy or the broken streets of Italy, he saw three different enemies. He saw the Americans, and he feared their factories, the never-ending waves of tanks, the skies filled with airplanes, and the seemingly endless supply of artillery shells that could turn any area into dust. He saw the British, and he respected how tough they were, their strong discipline, and the power of an empire that refused to give up after 5 years of total war. But when he saw the Canadians, that was different. The fear of the Canadian soldiers was not a fear of machines, and it was not a fear of how many there were. It was a fear of the men themselves. This raises one of the most interesting questions of the entire war. Why? Why did the German commanders, the masters of fast warfare, call a small volunteer army from a country across the Atlantic Ocean their most dangerous enemy? Why did the SS, in their secret reports, often say the Canadians were fiercer than both the Americans and the British? The answer is not found in the big strategy maps of generals like Eisenhower or Montgomery. It is found in the mud of the Scheldt, where men fought waist-deep in freezing water. It is found in the destroyed houses of Ortuna, where the rules of war were thrown away for knives and grenades. And it is found in a terrifying reputation that the Canadians didn't just inherit from their fathers in World War I, but one they earned again with a toughness that shocked even their friends. If you want to learn more amazing stories from history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. To understand this mystery, we must first forget the modern image of Canada. Today, the world sees a nation of peacekeepers known for being polite and diplomatic. But the Canada of 1939 to 1945 was completely different. It was a nation building its identity through war. While the United States brought the huge power of mass production to the battlefield, creating a massive army that often had to rely on untrained soldiers to fill its quickly growing ranks, Canada took a different path. The Canadian Army was small. It had only 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades in Europe. But what it lacked in size, it made up for with deadly skill. Unlike the American way, which moved troops around constantly, or the British way, which was tired from fighting alone since 1940, the Canadians spent years in Britain waiting. They trained. They drilled. They got tougher. They learned the strategy of shock infantry, an idea that focused on attacking hard, taking charge, and keeping violent momentum instead of being careful. By the time they fought in Europe, the average Canadian soldier was not just a volunteer. He was like a coiled spring ready to explode. The Germans quickly realized that these were not men who just fought for land. They fought with a personal intensity that was scary. While an American unit might call in an airstrike to destroy a machine gun nest, and a British unit might go around it carefully, the Germans found that Canadian units were surprisingly willing to get close, rushing at positions head-on in conditions that other armies thought were impossible. The difference was clear in the eyes of the enemy. Intelligence reports captured from the German 71st Infantry Division in Italy showed a clear change in morale when they realized they were facing the Canadians. The report said clearly, "The Americans kill you with their equipment. The British kill you with their persistence. The Canadians kill you because they want to." This video is not just a story of battles. It is a look into why the German army, the most professional army of the 20th century, feared the sight of the maple leaf patch. We will walk through the swamp of death in the Scheldt, the little Stalingrad of Ortuna, and the killing fields of Normandy to uncover the ruthless truth that history often overlooks. The Canadians were the Allies' shock troops, the ones called upon to do the dirty work that no one else could or would do. To understand how deep the German fear was, one must look past the propaganda films and into the dusty files of the German field reports. It is here, in the quickly typed reports sent from the front lines back to Berlin, that the true image of the Canadian soldier appears. It was an image shown not by the bravery of knights, but by the ruthlessness of predators. German strategy was built on precision, timing, and the superiority of their stormtrooper tactics. They were used to enemies who fought in a recognizable rhythm. The British, for example, were known to pause. They would capture an objective, secure it, have tea, and wait for supply lines to catch up. It was a predictable pattern that gave German commanders time to regroup and plan counterattacks. The Canadians, however, refused to play by these rules. A captured intelligence report from a panzer division in Italy noted a disturbing pattern. The Canadians fight aggressively and without pity. They do not recognize the natural pauses of battle. This was the first reason for the German fear, the relentless pursuit. When the sun went down, the battlefield was supposed to sleep. Night operations were very difficult, chaotic, and dangerous. Most Allied commanders preferred to dig in and wait for dawn. But the Canadians, using a tough adaptability, perhaps learned in the harsh wilderness of their homeland, owned the night. They became masters of the nighttime raid. German guards learned that darkness offered no safety. In fact, it was when the wild men were most likely to strike. A German paratrooper captured near Ortuna admitted that they could never relax against the Canadians because they move like ghosts and strike with knives. Then there was the weather. In the European theater, rain and mud were supposed to be the great equalizers, the forces that stopped offensives and forced stalemates. But reports from the Scheldt estuary, a battle fought in terrible conditions of flooding and freezing mud, reveal a German army in disbelief. They attack in weather no one should fight in, one officer wrote, while other armies waited for clear skies to use their air support. The Canadians advanced through driving rainstorms and waist, deep mud, to the German defender shivering in his foxhole. Seeing an enemy appear from the darkness of a freezing storm was mentally shattering. It showed that there was no sanctuary, no element of nature that could save them. But it wasn't just sheer aggression. If the Canadians were wild men in close quarters, they were cold, mathematical experts at range. This brings us to the second reason for fear artillery. The German army respected American artillery for its volume, but they feared Canadian artillery for its precision. Inheriting the hard, won lessons of the Canadian Corps in World War I, who had perfected counter, battery fire at Vimy Ridge, the Canadian gunners of World War II were arguably the best in the Allied coalition. German veterans often compared Canadian artillery coordination to that of the Soviets, the highest compliment of fear they could give. The Canadians didn't just fire, they created destruction. They used the creeping barrage with terrifying skill, walking a curtain of exploding shells just yards in front of their advancing infantry. For a German soldier, this meant there was no gap, no moment to lift his head and man his machine gun between the shelling stopping and the infantry arriving. The moment the explosion stopped, the Canadians were already in the trench, bayonets fixed. A German report from the Rhineland clearly warned its troops. If the shelling stops, do not look up. They are already there. Perhaps most unnerving of all was the Canadian refusal to retreat. In mobile warfare, pulling back was common. If a unit was surrounded or hit hard, it pulled back to save lives. Yet time and again, German counterattacks. The famous attacks that were the trademark of German defense would slam into Canadian lines and shatter. At Vere-Res Ridge in Normandy, against the elite 1st SS Panzer Corps, lesser units might have collapsed under the weight of Tiger tanks and fanatic infantry. The Canadians bent. They suffered terrible losses, but they did not break. They held ground with a stubbornness that defied tactical logic. To the German mind, which prided itself on military logic, this stubbornness was maddening. It turned minor fights into grinding wars of attrition that the shrinking German forces could not afford to fight. However, there is a darker shadow cast over this reputation, one that goes beyond tactics and toughness. As the war dragged on, a cycle of violence appeared between Canadian units and the Waffen SS that spiraled into something personal. It wasn't just about taking ground anymore. In the hedgerows of Normandy, after rumors and evidence of Canadian prisoners being executed by the SS began to spread, a grim determination settled over the Canadian ranks. The phrase, "Take no prisoners," began to be whispered and practiced. The Germans realized that in the Canadians, they were facing an enemy who had tapped into a reservoir of cold fury. They weren't fighting reluctant draftees. They were fighting men who had crossed an ocean to settle a score. This psychological edge is what led a German commander to issue a stark warning to his replacements. Be careful of the Americans. They have the tanks, but be terrified of the Canadians, for they have the hate. Yet this general reputation was only the beginning. The true test of this fear would be written in blood in 3 specific nightmares: a flooded estuary, a medieval town turned into a slaughterhouse, and a beach of doom. Reputation is one thing, reality is another. The German fear of the Canadian infantry wasn't built on rumors whispered in mess halls, but on the hard, undeniable facts of the battlefield. As the war went on, a pattern appeared in Allied high command. When a target was considered too difficult, too heavily defended, or the terrain too dangerous for standard operations, the order was often given: send in the Canadians. This role as the fixers of the Allied line placed the Canadian Army in some of the most hellish places of the war, forging their legacy in 3 distinct battles of fire. The first was Ortona, Italy, in December 1943. To the German paratroopers of the elite 1st Parachute Division defending it, Ortona was a fortress. Narrow medieval streets, stone buildings with thick walls, and rubble piled high created a sniper paradise. It was a trap designed to bleed an attacking army dry. The British 8th Army had stalled. The Americans were fighting elsewhere. It fell to the Canadians to break the deadlock. What followed was a battle of such savagery that journalists called it Little Stalingrad. But it was here that the Germans learned a terrifying lesson about Canadian cleverness. Realizing that stepping onto the street meant instant death from German snipers, the Canadians reinvented urban warfare. They developed a tactic known as mouse holing. Instead of using the doors or windows, Canadian soldiers would blast a hole through the attic wall of a building into the next house. They would throw in grenades, spray the room with submachine gun fire, and then scramble through the dust and smoke to clear the room in brutal hand combat. They moved through the entire town without ever touching the cobblestone streets. The German defenders were confused. They were prepared to fight an enemy who advanced along the roads. They were not prepared for an enemy who ate their way through the walls, like termites through concrete and steel. The fierceness of the close quarters combat in Ortuna, fought with knives, bayonets, and bare hands, shook the confidence of the elite paratroopers. They had met their match not in superior numbers, but in sheer street fighting toughness. If Ortona was a nightmare of stone, the Battle of the Scheldt in late 1944 was a nightmare of mud. This was perhaps the defining moment of the Canadian war effort, and the one most showing why the Germans feared them. The Allies desperately needed the port of Antwerp to supply their armies, but the approaches were controlled by dug in German fortifications in a flooded landscape. The terrain was terrible. Flat, flooded fields, waste, deep freezing water, and mud that swallowed men whole. It was a suicide mission. The British armored divisions could not operate there. The Americans were focused on the drive to the Rhine. Once again, the job went to the 1st Canadian Army. German commanders defending the Scheldt called it the Swamp of Death. They believed the terrain itself was their greatest ally, making any infantry assault impossible. They were wrong. The Canadians attacked. They attacked across open dikes swept by machine gun fire. They attacked through water that turned red with blood. They used vehicles like the Buffalo amphibious carriers, but mostly they used toughness. The psychological impact on the German defenders was deep. To see an enemy advancing steadily through an icy flood, ignoring mines and mortars, creates a sense of inevitability. It broke the German will. A captured German major said that while the American soldier fought well, when he had a dry pair of socks and a hot meal, the Canadian soldier fought as if the misery of the elements was his natural home. By clearing the Scheldt, the Canadians didn't just open a port. They proved that there was no terrain on Earth where they could not fight. And then there was Normandy. While Day is often remembered for the American losses at Omaha, the Canadian landing at Juno Beach was equally dangerous. Facing bunkers, seawalls, and a rising tide that delayed their landing craft, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division stormed ashore, directly into the teeth of the Atlantic Wall. Yet, by the end of that longest day, the Canadians had moved deeper into France than any other Allied force, American or British. But the true horror and the true forging of the reputation came in the days that followed, in the hedgerows of Caen. Here they met the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, a unit made of fanatic teenagers led by hardened Eastern Front veterans. The fighting was primal. It was fueled by mutual festering hatred. After the SS executed Canadian prisoners at the Ardennes Abbey, the nature of the war changed. Word spread through the Canadian ranks like wildfire. The rules of war were thrown away. The Canadians stopped taking prisoners. the SS, used to intimidating their foes, found themselves facing an enemy who returned their fanaticism with a cold, efficient fury. The Canadians earned a reputation among the SS, not just as soldiers, but as executioners. In the meat grinder battles for Caen and the Falaise Pocket, the Canadians were the anvil upon which the German army was smashed. The fear they inspired was so great that German units would often desperately try to surrender to British or American units on their flanks, rather than face the Canadians directly in front of them. From the rubble of Ortona to the mud of the Scheldt and the hedgerows of Normandy, the message was clear. The Canadians were not just participating in the war. They were ending it, one brutal yard at a time. To fully understand the unique standing of the Canadian infantry, we must place them side by side with their brothers in arms. The Allied invasion of Europe was a team effort, a massive three-pronged attack into the heart of Nazi Germany. But to the German commanders watching from their bunkers, the three prongs of this attack, American, British, and Canadian, felt very different when they struck. First, consider the Americans. By 1944, the United States Army was a force of nature. To the German High Command, the Americans represented the terrifying inevitability of industrial warfare. They had a supply system that was the envy of the world. If a German Tiger tank destroyed a column of 5 American Shermans, the next day 10 more would appear on the horizon. The German fear of the Americans was a fear of suffocation. They knew they could not win a war of attrition against a nation that could make tanks faster than Germany could make bullets. However, regarding the infantry specifically, the German assessment was often critical. In the internal memos of the German army, American infantry units were often described as brave but inexperienced. The U.S. Army expanded so fast that many units entering combat in 1944 were green. They relied heavily on their overwhelming firepower to solve tactical problems. If an American unit ran into a machine gun nest, they would often stop and call in an airstrike or a massive artillery barrage to level the entire area. It was effective, yes, but it was impersonal. It lacked the tactical skill of close quarters aggression. The German soldier feared the American machine, but he believed that man for man. On a level playing field, he was better than the American GI. Then consider the British. The British Army was the seasoned veteran of the conflict. They had been fighting since 1939, enduring the humiliation of Dunkirk, the bombing of London, and the scorching sands of North Africa. By the time they reached Normandy, the British soldier was highly disciplined, tough, and technically skilled. But the British Army was also tired. After 5 years of total war, Britain was running out of men. This reality affected their tactics. Field Marshal Montgomery and his commanders were famously cautious. They fought a bite and hold style of warfare designed to keep casualties low. They would take an objective and immediately dig in, refusing to overextend. While the Germans respected the British soldier for his toughness in defense, they did not fear his unpredictability. They knew the British would rarely take insane risks. They were a known quantity, steady, dangerous, but methodical. And then there was the Canadian. The Canadian Army occupied a terrifying middle ground that combined the strengths of both allies while throwing away their weaknesses. Like the British, they were equipped with the best of the Commonwealth's training and strategy. They were disciplined and knew how to coordinate artillery and armor with a skill that matched the Royal Army. But unlike the British, They were not war-weary. They were fresh. They had the high morale and physical strength of a volunteer force that had been training for this moment for years. And like the Americans, they had an aggressive, can-do spirit, a frontier mentality that valued taking charge and improvising. But unlike the Americans, they were not green. The core of the Canadian infantry was made of long-serving volunteers who had sharpened their skills in the commando training grounds of Scotland before ever setting foot in France. This combination created a soldier that the Germans found impossible to categorize and thus impossible to counter. The Canadians fought with the technical precision of the British, but attacked with the reckless abandon of a fresh American unit. German General Eberbach, analyzing the Allied forces, noted that while the British would stop to consolidate, the Canadians would keep coming. They practiced deep battle. When they broke through a line, they didn't just dig in. They swarmed into the rear areas, disrupting supply lines and command posts. They were shock troops in the truest sense of the word. Furthermore, there was a political dimension that translated into battlefield fierceness. The Canadian generals, like Guy Simonds, were not just fighting for ground. They were fighting for national identity. Canada was a small nation trying to prove its worth on the global stage. They demanded complex, high-prestige objectives to show the world what they could do. This filtered down to the common soldier. They weren't just fighting as a minor unit of the British Empire. They were fighting as Canadians. This nationalistic pride created a unit bond that was incredibly difficult to break. The German soldier on the ground felt this difference deeply. Facing an American sector meant enduring an artillery storm. Facing a British sector meant a grinding battle of attrition. But facing a Canadian sector meant you were likely to be attacked at night in a rainstorm by men who knew exactly how to use their bayonets and who seemed to take a grim satisfaction in the intimate brutality of infantry combat. As one captured officer from the 12th SS Panzer Division supposedly said during questioning, "We knew when we were fighting the Canadians. The fighting was harder, the shelling was closer, and there was no mercy." It wasn't that the Canadians were supermen. It was that they were the perfect storm of training, motivation, and timing. They arrived on the battlefield when the Germans were vulnerable, and they struck with a hammer that was both heavy and incredibly sharp. So we return to the question that haunts the records of the Second World War. Why did the mighty German army, the conquerors of Europe, tremble at the sight of the Canadians? It was not because the Canadian army was invincible. They bled, and they bled heavily. In fact, the casualty rates for Canadian infantry units in Normandy were among the highest of any Allied nation. But it was precisely this willingness to bleed that terrified the enemy. The Germans were students of war. They understood logic, tactics, and self-preservation. In the Americans, they saw a mirror of the future. A war fought by machines and overwhelming logistics. In the British, they saw a mirror of the past, a war fought by empire and stubborn discipline. But in the Canadians, they saw something primal. They saw an enemy that fought not for global strategy, but for the inch of ground directly in front of their boots. The Canadian infantryman became the boogeyman of the Western Front because he broke the psychological contract of modern warfare. He attacked when it was irrational to attack. He fought when he should have retreated. And he carried a grudge that turned professional soldiers into ruthless avengers. From the sniper, infested ruins of Ortona to the flooded dikes of the Scheldt, the Canadians did the dirty work. They were the shock army of the British Empire, the sledgehammer pulled from the glass case only, when the door refused to open. This reputation came at a terrible cost. Being the best meant being sent to the worst places. The names of the battles: Dieppe, Ortona, Verres Ridge, the Scheldt, the Hochwald Gap, are not just victories, they are graveyards. But in those graveyards, a new national identity was born. Canada did not come out of World War II as merely a colony of Britain. It came out as a nation forged in fire, demanding a seat at the table, not because of its size, but because of the weight of its sacrifice. For the German soldier shivering in his foxhole in 1945, watching the relentless advance of the khaki-clad troops from the north, the details of geopolitics didn't matter. All that mattered was the fear. A fear that was uniquely Canadian. Perhaps the most chilling ending for the German experience against Canada was found not in a history book written decades later, but in the immediate, terrified assessment of a German officer from the 346th Infantry Division. As his lines crumbled and his men surrendered to the wild men they had learned to dread, he wrote a final report that summarized the futility of opposing them. His words echo across the decades, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the Canadian Corps. When the Americans attack, we call for artillery. When the British attack, we call for reserves. But when the Canadians arrived, we knew the battle was over. Don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone who loves learning about history.